So the first video I did was in a book called 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. And when I read that book, it was a really big book and it was a really challenging book, and I really made that my point in the beginning of that video. Later on, someone who had watched it left a comment that they liked my analysis and that they would be intrigued to hear how I would, in that case, analyze a book called Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon. Now I have heard of Pynchon before, but I had never read anything by him. I only heard the name. I went out, I bought the book, kind of just blindly trusting a random person on the internet. Afterwards, before I had actually started to read it, I looked up the book on one of those apps. I use Storygraph, but it's like Goodreads. The Storygraph app, it has like this thing where when you open a book, you can scroll down and you can see if the book is tagged for any kind of a trigger, any kind of a triggering content, like violence or anything like that. And there were definitely triggers. I think that there was literally not a single thing from that list of triggers that was not tagged in this book. And to make things even weirder, not only were there like, and there was like everything like a violence, a sexual violence, incest, everything you can think of was on the list. But the number one, because it rates like the tags based on how often or how many people tag the book for that particular trigger, the most tagged trigger was, believe it or not, fucking excrement. And that really right there should have been my first sign when I was reading this book, to prepare myself for something that I really, really, really did not expect in any way, shape, or form. In the end, I did make 2 short videos about this on Instagram. I said that comparing to Bolaño, you know, in the end, when I read Bolaño, I felt like everything kind of fell into its place. Here, I did not get that feeling that anything fell into its place. But all the more for it, I feel like that's why this book is important to talk about. So let's dive into Gravity's Rainbow. So talking about this book, I want to start with structure, because there kind of isn't one. Anyone who's heard my previous video on We Do Not Part by Hong Kong may have noticed a comment I made how that book is incredibly sectioned. Like there are chapters and then there are subsections and there are parts written in italics because there may be letters or there may be fragments of dreams. I said I love that because the more sections there are in a book, the more the book is formatted, the easier it kind of is for me to read it because I feel like it's chunked out, portioned out. This book does not do that. This book is, nominally it is divided into 4 parts. If you would ask me the difference between those parts, like what do they represent? Why is it divided in that way? I would not be able to tell you. I didn't get it. I don't know. If anybody has any questions about things that I didn't get about this book, because there will be a lot of them, feel free to go online and just look up, I don't really remember what I Googled, but look up Pynchon Gravity's Rainbow Wiki, because it has like a whole web page of references of every single detail in this book. So maybe there is an explanation for why the book is divided into those 4 parts, but my point would be that as a regular reader, you know, like I'm a passionate reader. I'm not an academic. I'm not a literary critic. This isn't my job. This is my hobby. It's my pastime. So what I want to do is I want to enjoy it. I want to, snuggle up with a good book in bed and a cup of coffee. And Thomas Pynchon is the literal opposite of that. Like there is nothing more distant to this comfy, cozy sentiment of snuggling up with a good book than reading Gravity's Rainbow. Because Gravity's Rainbow it's just mostly, to me, as a layperson, incomprehensible. Now, that isn't to say that you can't get something out of reading it, because you can. There are some general topics that you can identify in the book. But, I don't know. Anyway, back to the structure. So as I said, it's divided into 4 parts. No idea why those 4 parts or what the distinction between them would be. In the beginning, as I started reading the book, I was really ambitious. So I looked up, and it turns out that each part, even though this is not formatted in the book, is divided into things called episodes. I just found that explanation online. I think it was on Wikipedia. Maybe that's not how everybody interprets it. But basically, these episodes are separated by, I don't know, a slightly bigger spacing than you would normally have between regular paragraphs. In a desperate attempt to create structure where there was none, because I am a bit of a control freak, I started going through, like, each part. I would go through the entire section and I would look for all of these extra large spacings in between paragraphs, and then I would write episode 1, episode 2. Like, I would section it out for myself, because I tried reading it for the first time without doing that. And I mean, if we're gonna talk about structure, then we can't just talk about like the structure of the chapters. We need to talk about the structure of the text, which is like that the sentences are, I don't know, like the length of several paragraphs in other books. It really, it's like so mentally draining to read this book. Like, if you try to just, casually read before bedtime or something like that, don't do that with Gravity's Rainbow. You won't understand anything. You probably won't understand anything in either way, but not my advice. I pathologically tried to section it out for myself. It took me 2 tries to get into how I'm going to read the book. The second try was the successful one, let's say. I started very ambitiously. I started by underlining everything and making notes and sectioning out and marking quotes, important events. I was actually trying to get a good grip and to have a good overview of what the characters are doing, how the plot is evolving and developing. And that is really a mistake. You should not do that. If you're reading this book, just let it go. For me, as a person with a very strong need to control things, that was very hard to do. But if you have that capacity, it will do you good if you're reading this book. While I was going through all this, I realized that the plot, when they say the plot thickens, where the plot exponentially grows and explodes in this book. And there are so many side quests and digressions and twists and turns. And by the end of it, you feel like you fell into some kind of a black hole, or that you just became completely delusional throughout reading this book, because you cannot keep track of everything. It's just how it is. It's to be accepted and embraced if you want to get through this book. My initial attempt of Googling every single reference so that I would understand every single thing that Pynchon wanted to say or interpret, that did not end well. It took me a week to read the first, 50 pages that way. And then I thought, this is not feasible. I'm going to be reading this book for the rest of my life. And I don't really think Gravity's Rainbow is that good. I wouldn't sacrifice that time. I started doing that less and less. And at the very end, I didn't do it at all, because I just felt fuck it, things are out of control, so I might as well just let go and go with the flow. I eventually managed to finish. I think that the way this book is structured, to me, when I finished it, finally gave a message, or the morale that I took out of it was, it's not about the fucking plot. So if it's not about the plot, what's it about? As I said, I could identify several themes, but one thing that I have to stop and think about, it is the style in which this book is written. Now, this is some kind of a postmodern experimental writing style, because, some sentences do not qualify as sentences, and just when you read through it, there's no coherence, there's no consistency, perspectives shift, characters shift, you have no idea. It's very hard to keep track who is even telling the story. I'm not really sure Like some things are written from perspectives of certain characters, some things are written like from a narrator's point of view, I guess. It's very unclear. In literary theory, there's probably a name for this, but for, common people, mortals like myself, there's really no name for this except for it being a really difficult book to read. But I think that in itself is one of the themes of the book. I think there's something about this book that revolves around the use of language, which for me felt like the language was broken. The discourse was broken. It was intentionally incoherent. It was intentionally shifting perspectives, and it was intentionally overwhelming. When you read this book, yes, sentences are long, but it's not just that the sentences are long, it's that this book is very, I almost want to say visual. Every scene is kind of depicted into the tiniest detail. Like if you would imagine the scenery around me being put into one sentence, every single thing that you can see around me right now, and then that being done 900 pages over and over again with multiple different places and contexts, and the timelines are also insane. Some things happen in the past, some things happen in the present. The present of the book is technically post World War II, the very ending of World War II. So there is something about the language intentionally being used like that. And I think the reason behind it is related to one of the underlying topics of the book, which I think is the nature of sanity, or the nature of madness, if you will. And what is definitely sure is that the book itself, if you would read what it is about, if you look at the blurb on the back says, the year is 1944. And Tyrone Slowthorpe has a problem. Bombs are crashing down at the exact locations of his sexual conquests. That sentence describes 0.1% of what this book is about. Somewhere in the beginning of the book, this is mentioned, but this is such a tiny part. When you go into the book, because it's put into this ending of World War II context, Tyrone is an American soldier who's in Europe, and you get a whole myriad of characters. You don't get just Tyrone. You get everybody he's ever met is basically in the book. And everybody he's ever met also has an incredibly long life story and an incredibly complicated life story. And all those life stories kind of mix and tangle and come together and intersect. What you do realize is that the books, from the very beginning, it introduces this line of paranoia. But not paranoia just because Pynchon wants to deal with a particular mental illness, but paranoia as a symbol of breaking off with reality, detaching from what reality is. This moment is used to question, I believe, the nature of reality itself. Because everything that will happen to Tyrone will be incredibly improbable. It would be a set of circumstances that you would think the chances of these things happening are absolutely astronomical. But that is the point. Because it talks about this detachment from reality and the breaking of the mind, I believe that breaking of the mind is reflected in the breaking of the language. So a person who has a hard time to grasp what is happening to them, what is happening around them, how to interpret those things, would also have a hard time to create a cohesive, coherent story about their experience. This is how I interpret it. This is how I read it. So I think it's very important that the language is used to reflect the mental states of the characters, and honestly, sometimes even to just overwhelm us. I think that all this richness of detail, it can be so difficult to navigate. But think about it like this. It's not a poetic depiction of, oh, look at how the surroundings are. There's nothing poetic about this book. The language is dry. The language is factual. You're almost sick of reading it when it starts counting everything that you could see in a room. And I'm wondering if that's so because that's how the characters are experiencing their reality, overwhelmed with this sensory input that they have a hard time sorting through and categorizing and distinguishing what's relevant from what's not relevant. Because when you're paranoid, maybe every single detail can be of significance, so nothing can really be dismissed. In a way, you would imagine that that would help you create a visual of what's going on. But the truth is, even those things are so, even those descriptions are so infused with so many historical, cultural, any kind of references. You constantly feel like you need to look up things to understand why is it relevant to know that there was a picture on a table of an actress from, I don't know, the 1930s and who she was and what happened to her and her. It goes to bizarre levels of referencing things. And honestly, after a while, I gave up. But yes, I think the language is used primarily to challenge us to see how our intellect would start to function if we were so overwhelmed and so distressed and so detached from reality as maybe the characters are due to many circumstances in their lives. Another thing about the language that I wanted to say is that the language can be extremely graphic, especially when it comes to scenes of various types of violence. The reason why the book is triggering, and probably why it's tagged so much in the trigger section, is not solely because those topics of, incest are, addressed in the book, but also because they're so graphically depicted that you start to wonder if there is a reason behind this extremely raw portrayal of things. And I think that there is. I think that maybe this ending of a world war and people hiding away from rockets that are falling all over them and trembling in fear and constantly feeling like you can never relax. I wonder if this setting of extreme violence kind of strips us down to our most primal urges and makes our relationship to both violence and sex very primal. This rawness can partly be due to that, but it can also be maybe due to the fact that that's what war does to you. It exposes you to extremely violent content that normally we don't witness, but rather imagine, because we hear it in other stories, we see it maybe on the movies, we have a certain kind of intellectual and emotional distance to them, but in war, you are immersed into this. I think that Pynchon wants to give you the position to kind of vicariously, through these characters, witness such scenes and such violence, and realize how absolutely unequipped our minds can be to deal with that content, to interpret that content. Now, the next topic that I'm gonna address is, I called it free will conditioned. I think it's related to the topic of madness and sanity. There is a lot of insanity in this book. There's a lot of referencing to Pavlov, a Russian psychologist who identified and explained a learning principle of classical conditioning. There's a lot of psychotic decompensation happening all over this book, a lot of delusional content, a lot of references to hallucinations, to the extent that you would question what's real or not yourself. Here's the thing, Pynchon talks about psychology a lot. It is obvious that he wants to question certain things, like he wants to question the existence of free will. Tyrone Slowthorpe turns out to be a part of some sick experiment where he, as a child, from the earliest age, was conditioned, was a part of some kind of an experiment on another human being by some kind of a doctor called Laszlo Yamf. And I think what Pynchon is getting at is that we have so many influences around us throughout our lives, right? First, we are born with a certain set of genes, so we have a biology that determines quite a lot of who we are and we're going to become, or what we are capable of becoming. And then there are like billions of influences around us. I think this is a nod to that idea that everything around us is kind of priming us or conditioning us or influencing us, nudging us in a particular direction, that really there is not a lot of space left for the concept of free will. I actually made a note about that. It took me like, oh my god, I just ripped, never mind. Let's ignore this. Somewhere 2/3 of the book in, I actually made a note about this. I wrote something like, we have the illusion of free will, but are actually classically conditioned by the systems we live in since birth to think, feel, and make choices that we do. This can be within like national socialism or liberal capitalism or any kind of big system that way. But then I write, once conditioned, we end up fighting for that system, as in, for example, World War II. Being exposed to the atrocities of war can lead to a psychotic breakdown and a potential uncovering of the matrix in a form of a sort of a red pill moment, and finding reason, in fact, in insanity. Okay, so it's a complicated trail of thought that I have here. So I think what I'm going for here is that we're extremely conditioned by the systems we live in. So today, maybe we can mostly relate this to capitalism, liberal capitalism, right? And if you would think, for me, it reminded me of that movie, I think it was Slavoj Žižek's movie, The Pervert's Guide to Ideology, you know, when he kind of goes downtown and he shows how every commercial, every kind of advertisement, any pictures, anything that we can see is meant to kind of prime us, to nudge us to think in a certain way, to go in a certain direction. And yes, I did feel like it had a little bit of a Matrix moment as well, because you're so immersed, you go into it, you fight for that system, you live through it. But then when you see the dark side of the system, when the system fails you, when it exposes you to some kind of atrocity, like in this particular book, it's World War II, but it can be anything else really. Like I'm assuming in terms of capitalism, it can be like realizing that our cell phones are made, you know, by children in some other country, in factories where there are no workers' rights. Like when we're exposed to that, it's a breaking point in our nervous system, because we realize that, but all of these desires, all of these wishes, all of these things that I'm feeling, that I'm thinking, that I believe, that feel so specific to me and uniquely mine and very organic and very, very genuine, but they're just like kind of an ideology that I've been served. And it does have a little bit of that red pill moment, like I've chosen to see the truth, you know, because that's a bit like, that's how I've seen Tyrone, really, like a little bit like Neo in the Matrix. I don't know if this is blasphemy to say. I'm not really sure if this is a comparison that I'm allowed to make, but I think you're gonna get my point. In a way, breaking with reality becomes a way of finding sanity within the madness, because madness is defined as detaching yourself from whatever the predominant ideology is that you've been conditioned to think in. I think it's interestingly done, but I do think it's just too complicated. Like, I mean, he's not the first to question free will. And honestly, of all the ways you can do this, this is the most pain in the ass kind of way you can do it. Reading hundreds of pages of like completely delusional, fragmented discourse on dozens of characters, none of them anywhere close to, you know, mentally coherent in any way, shape, or form. I mean, it's just too much. Like, I would say that, while this is a really big part of the book and really important part of the book, it also feels a bit like you could have done it simpler. Now, do I necessarily agree with Pynchon in this questioning of free will? Because I don't think he really leaves a lot of space for there to, like, it's not presented as a debatable subject to me. I don't feel like he's questioning free will and asking me, what do you think of this? I think he's telling me, you have no free will. That to me is a negative in the book. I would appreciate it more if I was presented with a situation in which I would be unsure of the answer and I would be able to argue both sides. And that's not done here. In that sense, the book felt very one-sided. I felt like it was very... I don't think anybody can really give an answer to this except for maybe neuroscientists and philosophers, but I'm neither one of those things, so I'm not gonna, you know, profess anything. Very deterministic. Now, in one of the previous sections, I mentioned how I perceived Tyrone Slowthorpe as a kind of a Neo from the Matrix character. And I do see kind of a paradigm of the Matrix, of realizing that everything you believed was real really isn't. And throughout the book, I can see, no matter how incoherent or how disconnected certain storylines and side quests and digressions might have felt while I was reading, I feel like they had like something in common. And that thing in common is that there is always some kind of a mind-altering, mind-bending experience involved, whether it's through the prism of psychosis or whether it's through the prism of the use of psychoactive substances. There's always this notion that you feel slightly insecure if what's happening is real or part of somebody's subjective experience or the way that they interpret their circumstances. And that's a very tricky thing. And the more I talk about the book, the more I kind of extract these themes, I realize how distant they feel to the very plot of the book, all of the characters that have been introduced. Note that I'm not really referring to any of them, and I don't really refer to any particular episodes in the novel. And that's because, in a way, I feel like everything that the novel offered in terms of plots and characters and these kind of formal settings in which the story takes place is more of a tool to address these meta topics. I genuinely meant what I said when I said that this book isn't about the plot. It's not so much whether or not you can follow through the story, but rather about understanding that you need to let go and see where the story will take you in the way you're thinking about it. Now, when it comes to mind-altering experiences, there's something about that always brings me back to the topic of subjectivity, phenomenology, first-hand experience. And when I think about subjectivity, I think also about literature and the idea of the unreliable narrator, which in this book is definitely very strong. There is no reliable narrator, if you would ask me. And the way that the author plays with who is telling the story is also quite interesting. At some points, I felt like what he was doing is like juggling an illusion of objectivity that we sometimes have in literature through the role of third-person writing, as in there is a narrator that kind of overlooks and sees the whole situation and lays it out for us. And then there are the characters who have their own limited knowledge of only what they perceive or know about the story that they're in. And I feel like this book does this in a very scattered way. Stressful thing to read Gravity's Rainbow, because the subjective and the objective kind of merge and digress from each other, and then they get intersected at some spots, and it's very hard to make those distinctions. Now, previously I've said that I think that is because I believe this to be a way of getting us into the mindset of the characters. But I guess I would also say that one should be careful with that interpretation, because it really depends what character we're talking about. I mean, Tyrone, yes, but for the other characters, I'm not sure, and many of them have gotten quite a lot of space. Actually, they've gotten so much space that I was surprised that their characters haven't developed more, or that we didn't find out more about them, but rather we got really big chunks in different parts of the book. But it felt very unfinished. It felt like I didn't really get their story. And obviously, I've already mentioned this in the language part, this part with like things that are mind altering or like that question the nature of truth, reality, of whether or not one can trust its own senses to tell them what is real and what is not. This is reflected in the language in which the book has been written, which is why very often I had this feeling that this book is absolutely incomprehensible. I've also been going through some of my own notes on the book and what I have jotted down while reading. And I'm noticing that a lot of it is related to some conflicting terms, like the way he addresses certain psychological terms like claustrophobia. It juxtaposes nodding into versus disentanglement. How he plays with the idea of absolute zero, something that's nearing death. And this sentiment of claustrophobia is combined with the sense of impending doom, a sense of irrelevance, a need to self-medicate. There's a lot of that. There's a sense of impending doom throughout it. No matter how early on it begins, it never really gets resolved. And there's a lot of bizarre content, which makes even very real scenes seem completely out of place. Like, the novel begins with this group of soldiers who are growing bananas in some building somewhere in London, where they're at the same time, I don't know if they're hiding or if that's just their temporary placement, but they are tracking rockets and they're actively participating in these wartime activities, but at the same time growing bananas and making banana smoothies and milkshakes and pancakes, all the while doing it. And when you read stuff like that, that's what makes it so mind-altering. That's what makes it so like, this cannot be happening. This is surreal. And there's a lot of surreal and a lot of absurd in this book. And there is this scene, even like, if we're talking about the banana scene, like picking bananas while watching a rocket shoot and waiting for it to hit you. And I mean, it captures the sentiment of the book, which can be very difficult to translate into words and analyze later on. And it's interesting that the book has a very strong sentiment to it, because this book is generally quite devoid of emotions. It feels like everything's been left on the level of ideas, the cognitive, the intellectual. There's a lot of things happening that are emotionally provoking, but there's not a lot of emotional content in the book itself. The only feelings that I could really note would be the feelings of, as I mentioned, impending doom, of solitude, of feeling lost, of feeling confused and not being able to find your way in life. Or not being able to understand yourself, your life, what has been going on. A profound sense of being lost. It's a book that's very filled with some kind of existential dread, even though that dread isn't explicitly put into words in the book from the sides of their characters. It's more their actions and things that they describe, how they interpret things happening around them and how they think about those things that maybe reveal or allow you as a reader to read in what emotions might be lying behind. But it's definitely one of the books that's the most difficult to relate to. I don't really think this happens to me a lot, but when I read, usually there's something I can relate to in a book. There's some kind of character or some way of thinking that I can identify with, but here it really was none. It was approaching zero. That quest was failing fully. And that's what made it so hard to read, because it's really hard to read something that you're genuinely not interested in because you don't really care. And it's hard to explain how Pynchon managed to create such an incredibly dense story where there's so much happening, so many characters are presented, but there's no one you could possibly actually attach yourself to. The last theme that I want to address is the topic of desire. And I don't know if this is really a theme of the book, but it's definitely a tool that the author uses to provoke reactions to the book. And earlier when I spoke, I think, about language or free will, I'm not sure, I think I gave it quite a generous interpretation that a lot of the content that's related to sex is very graphic, and a lot of the sex that's happening, actually most of the sex that's happening in this book, is abusive or violent or in some way makes you feel really, really uncomfortable. There is definitely a certain amount of perversions, sexual perversions in the book. And there is this one, and I think that you really know, once you've read that scene, you know why the book was so tagged for excrement. And it's very simple, really, because there is this one very protruding coprophilic scene. And if you don't know what coprophilia are, then I'm gonna let you Google that one. I will say that it was so graphically depicted that I don't know how you are as a reader, but for me, I'm a very visual reader. Like when I read, I actually actively imagine, and when the book is good, I can really feel like I'm in another universe and that I'm living through stuff vicariously through the characters. And that was really not optimal for this particular scene, because once I've read it, I could never unsee it in a way in my head. I have to say, even though I made a claim that it can be provoking or that it could be putting the reader in the uncomfortable position of facing certain things, certain truths, certain atrocities in the end directly, it would be unfair to say that that was my impression during the very reading of this book. It would be more me now trying to interpret it in the best way possible, probably to rationalize the fact that I've spent so many hours, like it took me more than 2 months to read this book. So I need to justify it in my head by saying this was a really great piece of literature. And in a way, it is a great piece of literature, but I'm not gonna lie, while I was reading it, my personal first impression, and not even first, my general impression throughout the book has been that all of the sex and all of the violence, especially when it's about incest or when it's about pedophilia, it felt very, very, very gratuitous. It felt like it was there purely for the kind of, I don't want to say thrill of it, but for the shock value of it, you know? I don't know if this was a thing in American literature at some point, or if this is just something that Thomas Pynchon wanted to do, but it felt like I was supposed to be shocked and disgusted by how far he's willing to go in depicting these things in a very graphic and a very insensitive manner. And if that was the goal, I mean, it's been accomplished. If the point is something that I haven't been able to understand, maybe I don't see some kind of a higher truth about it. I'm doing this analysis purely from my own point of view, so I'm not quoting any literary critics, nor did I read other criticisms of Pynchon's work. And maybe there are people who see true value in it. They think that this has been done well, but I generally don't. There are so many better ways of doing that. This was not necessary, and I don't appreciate this approach the things. Obviously, despite the fact that there's a lot of sex in it, there's no sex scene that actually is portrayed as a genuine form of intimacy or any context where people are comfortable with. There's always something that feels kind of off in all of the sex scenes of the book, and they are many. It's very accentuated, this thing with the sexuality. I can understand that maybe the closeness of death and the sense of impending doom, maybe those things can sometimes throw us back to our most primal urges and provoke in us a certain level of desire that makes us feel alive in spite of the gloom that we're surrounded with. But I'm not sure that this was the best way for me to do it when it comes to writing style and when it comes to just purely practically how it was written. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to the person who made the comment. Now, from how I began and how I've been analyzing the book, one might think that that I regret reading it, and I actually don't. I'm not gonna lie, Pynchon is not my author. This is not my cup of tea. I struggle with books that require me to go like scavenging the internet for information and gathering references and interpreting and reading what other people think to understand the book. I don't know why, but that just doesn't work for me. I want to read a book and I want to feel like I've gotten something out of it just by reading it myself. This is a book that's primarily written for the literary critics, for the literary academics, for somebody whose job it is to, open and page by page, underline every word, every sentence, analyze commas, interpunctuation, everything, how it works. It's not really what an average avid reader, I think, does. I think most people, and this might be just me generalizing stuff, but at least that's how it is for me. I want to read a book and I want to enjoy that process. Now, enjoyment doesn't necessarily mean that the book needs to be a feel-good kind of a content. Not at all, but this was not an enjoyable thing to read. I'm glad that I did read it because I now have a different view of, first of all, I've been introduced to a completely new form of literature to me. And secondly, I don't like to have opinions that are unsupported with either facts or experience. And now at least I've had experience with Thomas Pynchon, so if somebody asks me why I don't like it, I can very much explain why I don't. There is something, I believe, slightly sadistic about how this book was written. I think we can't really get past that. Even those who like the book, maybe they're into that form of torture, but I am not, personally. It's not my kink. So this isn't something that I would be able to recommend to someone else, because when I can't relate to a book and when I can't really define what it gave me, it's hard to know why is it that I'm recommending it. I will also say one more thing, and that is that I, as a reader, when I read content that's so infused with references and that you have to go online and look for stuff to understand and reread, and it takes a lot of time, I think there is a group of people that read that stuff and they think, oh, this is so intriguing, I love this makes me go and explore all of these other different things and ideas and concepts and worlds, and it just makes me, it gives me a desire to live and to learn and to read more. And I am the opposite of that. I am the kind of person that feels like, okay, you want me to reread your book 1,000 times to understand it? I feel like you are a pretentious person who wants me to only read your stuff, and you want me to feel like I'm unable to understand you. I have a very easy time falling into that kind of way of thinking, even though that doesn't necessarily have to do anything with why the author actually did it. I don't really think that I have any claim to how Thomas Pynchon is as a person. As far as I've learned by now, he's an extremely private person, so there's not a lot of people who actually do know much about him. But for me, it's easy to fall into that line of thinking, and that's what didn't make the process of reading Gravity's Rainbow enjoyable. But Gravity's Rainbow is definitely a book that can raise a lot of big topics and a lot of discussions around huge themes that are more maybe philosophical themes when you really look at them. It kind of goes step by step. The more you think about it, of this, if I would call these meta themes, because they're not literally addressed in the way that I've talked about them in the novel, they're huge and they're very interesting to be discussed. I just think that there are many other books that address the same topics, but in ways that might be easier or more accessible to me, or just maybe better suited to my personal set of preferences in literature. So that's it for me and for Pynchon. I do thank the person who recommended me this book. It's been a life-changing experience reading it, and it's given me a lot to think about, even though I'm most probably never gonna read Pynchon again. Sorry. But anyway, until next time, see you.